startups, it gets very expensive, right? But in Wales, we speak English much faster. Right? Welsh, actually, the words come together. The first letter of every noun changes according to the word that comes before it. And so we tend to do that with English. So if I start to do it, just do that, right? What I want to do is to talk a little bit about where we are in management overall. We're actually going through a major phase shift at the moment, and the last time we went through one of these was the 1980s. And that has fairly significant consequences for the way that the future of IT is going to go. And I'm really going to argue against anybody who says IT should be aligned with strategy. Because I think it's taken a linear concept. One of the points I'm going to make is people in corporate strategy do not really know what IT can do. Yeah, the speed of change in technology is faster than users know how to place demands. And that has major consequences for any linear type of process. So I want to set a context for that. I'm going to talk about these big moves in management. I'm going to talk about the need to recognize failure. Under conditions of uncertainty, failure increases rapidly. If we try and stop failure, actually the failure becomes more catastrophic. And I'll go through some of the reasons for that. And then I'm going to finish off by looking at some of the new work on how do you map cultures and a key concept called anticipatory triggers. How do you trigger human beings to a state of alert when they need to look at something because change is happening but it's not visible? If you don't know, the origins of the work I'm talking about today were when I worked in IBM and we got summoned down to Washington and worked on counter-terrorism before and after 9/11. And there we were looking very specifically at what's called weak signal detection. How do you spot things early that after the event you realize were significant, but you don't realize they were significant at the time? And there were two big approaches in DARPA in those days. One was called TIA, Total Information Awareness. And that took the approach that most people do in IT. It assumed that algorithms and data were the solution to everything. I call this the one algorithm to rule them all and in the darkness bind them school of thinking, all right, with multiple implications. Yeah? The second group was myself and Marlo Park in Stanford, and we were looking at what are called human sensor networks. How do you increase human agency in a sensor system so that you can see patterns that technology of itself on its own cannot detect? Right? So you're going to see that coming through. So the first thing to make, and this is an important point, is we need to get rid of the engineering metaphor which underpins current management methodology. This came in the 1980s with systems thinking, originating in the work of people like Forrester and Beer, popularized by Hammer and Chamfrey in re-engineering the corporation. Anybody old enough to remember re-engineering the corporation? And at the soft end of it, learning organization, Peter Senge. And the underlying metaphor here was the assumption you could design a system. You could cope with uncertainty by deciding where you wanted to be. And if you look at nearly every method at the moment, yeah, a group of executives come together with very expensive consultants and create a wonderful plan about what the future will be in 3 years or 5 years' time. Always find it amusing that American capitalism has adopted the planning cycle of Soviet Russia, but never mind, all right? It has the same sort of implications. And then some wonderful change program is initiated in which everybody is told, if only we achieve these goals, everything will be wonderful. And the fact that we go through those cycles every 3 years and we never do, people just haven't caught up to the fact it's a bad idea. In fact, I'll give you a statement I'll justify later. If you want to have change in an organization, the worst possible thing you can do is to announce a change initiative. And I'll come back to that later. Yeah? Partly because it just triggers awful memories with anybody who's been around for more than 4 or 5 years, but also it's the wrong approach. It assumes a human system can be designed like a machine. Yeah? The really big question facing IT over the next 10 years is to rethink the whole concept of architecture. Architecture cannot be displayed like a plant drawing for a chemical plant, a series of boxes with structured flows between it. That's not how an architect works, particularly within an ecosystem. But engineering came in the 70s, everybody got excited. The other reason it came in is that's the growth of scalable computing. People forget this. Computers were too expensive until the 80s to really be deployed. Round about the 1980s, computing becomes affordable, and the trouble is it gets very exciting. This is a wonderful new tool, and humans are very susceptible to tools. I call it techno-fetishism. We got a new tool, it appears to be wonderful, and we start to overemphasize its importance. If you look at, well, I'll give you an example. I took my daughter out of studying psychology at the age of 16 because the textbook started off with the assumption of psychology is the human brain is a limited capacity information processing system. And I thought, you're not doing that, all right? It's really bad science. But if you look at the language of management is the management of engineering. It starts to assume that people are, in effect, components on the shelf of a manufacturing plant. Just to give you an illustration, one of the things which happens back in the 80s is a sudden growth of psychometric testing. Anybody done Myers-Briggs? No? Nobody done it? Okay. Zero scientific basis whatsoever to Myers-Briggs. Jung himself rejected it as a concept, although they keep that quiet. It was a questionnaire put together by a mother to understand a daughter, which she thought might have application, and it got picked up by Hay Consulting and became effectively a cult. One of the things I'm proudest of in IBM is a structured 6-month test, which showed that astrology was more accurate than Myers-Briggs in predicting team behavior, and HR never quite forgave me for that one. Right? The reason that things like Myers-Briggs were attractive is it put human beings into little boxes. It says you're one of these type of people, therefore we can deploy you. And you see the manufacturing metaphor coming through in that. The reality is human beings can radically change what they are based on social interaction over a very short cycle time frame. There isn't anything pre-given. And something I'm going to emphasize 2 or 3 times today, you can actually change systems far faster by changing how people interact rather than by trying to change people. All these systems which tell people what sort of people they should be, aside from being unethical, and you see this at Agile conferences, the Agile leader and people put up a series of statements about what an Agile leader should be. They're generally platitudes. If you've been around, I'm over 60 now, I've seen this 8 times in business. Each time there's a wonderful new technique, the same platitudes are assembled, and the whole thing goes through the same cycle. The reality is, if you change how people interact with other people and with objects, they change very quickly. If you try and change them, it's all too hard. So understanding those interactions becomes far more important than understanding people. And the basic lesson of all of this, and again, I'm going to come to this specifically at the end, is we need to start managing in the present rather than managing to an idealized future state. Complexity science, which is the basis of my work, says you can't know the future anyway, but you can know the present. And trying to focus on an unknowable future and an unachievable future means you miss opportunities in the present or you get things radically wrong. And I'll talk about this specifically in the context of culture mapping shortly. So engineering is a problem, it comes in the 80s. What we're now starting to do is a shift to something which is much more ecological and interestingly is also about aesthetics or about art. Now, I'm now going to start to throw some science in. The thing I've been pioneering for the past 20 years is to use natural science as a way of understanding social systems. I'm trying to shift away from the idea of cases. And you're all familiar with cases. because 99% of management textbooks go and study 50 companies or 10 companies who are deemed to be successful. You're all familiar with this approach? Then they identify things that those companies do in common, and they say, if you do these things, you too will be successful. Okay, in real science, this is called the confusion of correlation with causation. If Poland wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes it wins per head of population, all you need to do is increase dark chocolate consumption. There's a direct correlation between consumption of dark chocolate and Nobel Prizes per head of population over the last several decades. So just go out and consume chocolate. It's easy, right? You don't need to invest in education. Yeah? Most successful companies have managing directors who play golf. It doesn't follow that if you only recruit golfing professionals, you will have a successful company. And secondly, often people don't get it right. One of the great classics of management literature, Good to Great by Jim Collins, studies a group of companies who've been very successful for a long period of time and actually does the correlation causation and says, you too can have this long-term success. Unfortunately, most of them are now failing, but that's a little bit embarrassing. But if you actually look at it with any knowledge of evolutionary biology, you say, but you chose the apex predators. You chose the companies that created a market where none existed. And in biology, that apex predator then survives, no matter how incompetent they are, until the ecosystem itself changes. Now, IBM being a good example. IBM dominates the hardware period of IT because it repurposed punch card machines from sewing machines to give it first mover advantage. The problem is that it's then immunized from commodification of pricing. Because it's the apex predator, it's the thing everybody buys, yet it doesn't notice that prices are dropping and it's becoming a market, a commodification market. So actually, it almost broke, never recovered its same level of dominance, and Microsoft took over. And remember, Microsoft repurposed software that IBM had paid them to develop, but IBM didn't see software as particularly important. And then guess what happens to Microsoft? They don't realize software is becoming a commodity, and we get Apple. Yeah, this is a standard sort of cycle that you see in industry. And I'm not going to go into this today, but this is a big issue on modern strategy, is where are you on that cycle? Have you got a stable ecosystem with an apex predator? Your strategy is to work around them, to be a Microsoft certified supplier or whatever. If the ecosystem is undergoing radical disruption, and I'll talk about that statistically in a minute, your strategy is to create multiple small experiments to see if you can stabilize the new ecosystem. When the meteor wiped out the Earth, or wiped out the dinosaurs, it wasn't the crocodile or the shark who was an apex predator, it was the first proto-mammal. Something very small, highly energy efficient, highly adaptive, is actually what comes through the next time round. And that's the history of our industry. Yeah? The other thing to say on this is not just an ecosystem metaphor, it's also the question of aesthetics. If you don't know it, art and music are co-created in human evolution around about the same time. Both of them come a long time before language. It's a unique aspect of human intelligence. Art comes before language. Yeah? And what actually happens, the evolutionary advantage of this, it's an accident when it happens. Somebody sketches something on a cave wall, it helps the hunt. But by moving up a level of abstraction, you can see connections between things which are apparently unconnected. For those of you using logic, this is called abductive logic. Yeah? The art has an ability to make human beings very, very creative. Yeah? And it's one of the problems we've got with the emphasis on engineering and STEM education and the reduction of art is we're actually damaging human creativity. Yeah? We now know in evolutionary terms the ability to see things in the abstract is part of making novel connections. And I'll come to that right at the end where I talk about how we match existing capability against unarticulated user needs. The important thing for service management going forward is not to respond well to existing community needs. That's a hygiene factor, just go do it. The value add is where you repurpose what you are already good at to do things that people didn't know they needed, but once they've got them, they find them very valuable. And that's what we see during these cycles, and that's called matching unarticulated needs. So another bit of science. This is the one which should really scare you if you're taking cases or any empirical approach sensibly. So this is radiologists. For reasons we don't understand, cognitive neuroscientists always conduct experiments on radiologists. At some stage in the past, they did something very, very bad, and the scientific community is getting revenge by using them as examples. Right, so a radiologist is dealing with X-rays, which are a limited information source compared with what you face as service execs. They've got 15 to 20 years training in a 4 to 5 generation body of knowledge. And you give them a batch of X-rays. On the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla in plain view, which is 48 times the size of an average cancer nodule, and you ask them to spot anomalies. Over 80% don't see it, even though their eyes scan it. And the scary thing is the small minority who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the other people. The good news is it means there are massive opportunities out there that you're not spotting. The bad news is that as a species, we don't see things unless we expect to see them. Right? Now start to think through the implications of this, and I'll give you the backup on this. The most anybody in this room scans of what is in front of them is about 3 to 5% of the available information. And of course, if you reduce everything to text, you're making it even worse. Yeah, we always know more than we can say. We will always say more than we can write down. What can be reduced to text is about 8 to 10% of what people know. Right? So the minute you move into highly digital environments, you're automatically limiting information sources, yeah, and you're actually making the problem worse. So the way we make decisions is we scan 3 or 4% of what's in front of us, and then we do a first fit pattern match with memory. Our own memory and the memory of other people told through stories. The radiologist has 30 to 40,000 patterns associated with their skill and training as a radiologist, and the most frequently used ones get activated first. We do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit patch match. So if somebody phones up your service desk, somebody listens to 3 or 4% of what's actually been said, and they match it against patterns based on what happened recently, and the more rigid your process, the more likely they are to actually make a mistake if something novel is happening. Now, in evolutionary terms, you can see why this happens. Think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa. Something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to artistically, scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and then book yourself on a 2-day certification course in how to avoid being eaten by lions? By that time, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of a case study of somebody escaping from the digestive tract of a large carnivore. We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly, privileging our most recent experiences. And there is no way you can build a computer system or train people not to do that. You see why we're starting to use natural science? That tells us there's some things which just won't work, and we have to work with that, not against it. It can also cost you an awful lot of money. I've done a lot of field ethnography in call centers, and by over-constraining the process, people miss opportunities to actually improve service. And the measurement system is part of that. So to kill you with the second one, meta-study of all available material done by real scientists. I don't class management scientists as scientists. Yeah, this is a meta-study, New Scientist reference, where people are working for explicit rewards. It destroys intrinsic motivation. What do we do on service desks? We make everything explicit. We force people into metrics on Kanban systems on development, and we judge them on what's explicit, and we don't realize that the reality of the human condition is that destroys intrinsic motivation. And where do we most need intrinsic motivation? Health, education, social services, service in general. Where do we have the most rigid targets? All of those areas. And again, the scientific evidence is very, very clear. If you need intrinsic motivation, highly explicit targets make things worse, not better. Right? Now, I'll come on to what are called vector targets later. They measure direction and speed of travel from the present, which is very different from an idealized statement of how things should be. Let me give an illustration, and it's not from your industry, and I'm choosing this deliberately. We were working with one of the big water companies in the UK. And it was the first time I really used ethnography. Ethnography is where you become a part of the workforce for 2 or 3 weeks. And you don't go in as a consultant, you go in as a entry-level worker. Yeah, so the first 2 weeks I worked as a water engineer. Yeah, dressed in blue overalls doing the shit jobs, right? And by the way, never ever ask a water engineer to give you a dirty job. It's a major mistake, right? Within half an hour, I was up to my neck in the stuff which comes out of houses. And I could hear the rats, but I couldn't see them. And I learned a lesson that day, all right, in terms of the way it works. 2 weeks later, I sat in a call center, and they gave me the worst performer and the best performer. When you do ethnography, that's what you ask for. And you can start to see where this story is going just by the way I set it up, all right? So I spend 3 or 4 days with the best performer, and it's really very boring. She follows the processes. She's got a voice to die for. Any middle-aged male would just roll over and do whatever they were told just to hear that voice, all right? Yeah, and they recruit people over the telephone, not physically. And she follows all the rules. She's about to get promoted. Then I get the worst performer, and I go to get her a cup of tea. Yeah, she's an older woman. She's been in the field. And I come back, and she's just ending up a call. Now, when I left, she was talking to somebody in Esher in Surrey. This is a really posh area of the UK. And the guy was complaining about water supply to his second swimming pool. Now, I mean, if you've got a problem with your second swimming pool, you really have got a problem, right? And then, as I came back, I heard her say, "Look, love," sorry, standard British phrase, all right? "Look, love, shoving your own shit up the tap won't get you rehoused. Here's a number to phone." So I sat down and I said, "What was that?" And she's changed her whole manner of speaking. It's quite fascinating. Her accent has changed. And so she replays the tape. And what happened is this woman phoned up and reported water contamination from Tower Hamlets. Right? Tower Hamlets in London is one of the worst slum areas in the whole of Europe. Yeah, it's a quite appalling area. You do not want to go there. Well, you don't want to go there anywhere, but you don't want to go there at night under any circumstances, right? And it turned out there's a rumor around if your water is contaminated, you get rehoused. So people are literally putting their finger into their own excrement and smear it into their taps and phoning up the water company and claiming a call out. Now, this woman knows about this because her husband is a water engineer. So she's heard about this stuff. So she's got this little booklet of organizations, church organizations, charities that help people. And she gives them those numbers. She spent twice as long on the call as she was meant to spend. But she saved them £50,000. Because if she'd gone through the process, an engineer would have called, they'd have discovered the fault, police and social services would have been called. You see where we're going on this? Yeah? She actually had an anecdotal base to her knowledge, based on experience, and she had the freedom to understand human motivation and to respond accordingly. One of the things we've seen in the UK is the BT helplines, service lines. We all know on informal networks when the Irish call centre is on, not the Indian call centre. And it's not racially prejudiced, it's just we understand the Irish and they understand us. It's a very different culture. Yeah, and that's actually quite important to understand. See where I'm going with this stuff? Yeah, and it links to that motivation. You've got to be very careful if you over-constrain a system, if you take an engineering approach, because you could get it badly wrong. So let's look briefly at this issue about resilience. And what I want to do here is to look at the common way in which we manage risk, right? So, and don't panic, by the way, I'll take a picture of each of these and you'll get them on the slides, but it's easier if I draw it. So most people manage risk based on one of these things called a bell curve, yeah? We all know bell curves? All God's children got bell curves, right? Type of Gaussian distribution. And the idea is, if I'm looking at risk, if I cover off everything within the bell curve, I can ignore this stuff because it's a low probability, potentially high impact event, but it's such a low probability I can't be expected to deal with it. Computer search algorithms work on this basic, market research works on this basis, and actually what's interesting is process improvement exercises, the design behind IT service desks, works to the center of a normal distribution. It's got to standardize, yeah, so it works to the center of a normal distribution. And that's actually okay if that is the correct distribution. The trouble is, if I do a double log scale of size against frequency, on any event, I get a dot curve which looks like this, and from that I can draw a straight line. It's not straight here. This is called a power law. And it's a type of Pareto distribution. So there are a lot of small earthquakes, a small number of large earthquakes. There are a lot of small complaints, a small number of large complaints, a lot of small software errors, or small number of, you get the principle on this? Now, if I overlay Pareto on Gaussian, the curve looks like this. I've now got a massive area of outliers, which actually means failure is inevitable. And if I try and avoid failure, people will just hide it for longer, so by the time it hits me as a manager, it will be too late for me to do anything about it. My main criteria in actually selecting people, and we select people based on seeing how they work for 6 months, is I want the people who know when to call for help. I don't want the people who try and solve problems and only pull me in when it's too late and too difficult. And that's because I've learned over the years, the more you get promoted, the more you only meet angry customers. It's a direct correlation, right? Higher levels of promotion, angrier and angrier customers, until you get right to the top, and then you can delegate it to somebody else and just take them out for dinner, all right? So there's an incentive there. Right? Now, if we look at this, and this is going to be core to what I'm talking about, here, both curves are the same, and we can deal with anything which is probable. Every time I've looked at any service-based solution which is based on process management and technology, it's operated in this space. It deals with the probable, and it actually tries to make everything fit into this because I've got a degree of structure. Yeah? And down here, I can almost take a deductive approach because there is symmetry between the past and the future. Nothing is going to happen in the future which hasn't already happened in the past, so I can use the past to predict the future state. And that's the basis of most management consultancy. Yeah? As I move out here, it gets more difficult. I've now got to deal with anything which is possible. Because I'm now getting asymmetry between past and the future. I'm getting some repetition, but increasingly I'm getting novel things which I didn't expect to see, or even the things which happen the same way happen with lots of variation, so there's subtle differences. Yeah? Now this is where we do things like cone of possibility, scenario planning, contingency planning. We kind of know what we're doing here. But we need to be careful because the cost is high and this is inductive. And then we get to this domain here. This is the domain where I have to deal with anything which is plausible. Now, probable, possible, plausible is an exponential increase. And what I now got is massive asymmetry in that what's happening is constantly novel with very little repetition. And that's where any type of rigid process approach or anything based on codification goes badly wrong. That's where, to be honest, in knowledge terms, you need natural talent and experience more than you need artifacts and codification. Apprentice models of learning work off 3 to 4 years in multiple cases of failure. And just to throw some other examples out, the training we now do for leaders is to take them through a one-day workshop in whichever they do, they fail. It doesn't matter. So I'm a Star Trek fan, so you know where I got the idea from. I used to do my physics homework to the first series of Star Trek. It's that sort of period. And you may remember, if you know it, that Kirk cheats because there's an exercise where whatever you do is you fail. Now, if you look at the work Klein and I did on this with the Singapore Army, after 3 rounds of successive failure, people scan 25 times more data before they make a decision than if they succeed. So training people in a failure environment increases learning over success. Now, it may sound ironic, but that's the way it is. People who win at games become complacent. People who lose at games learn. And also, while we're carrying out that learning, which is of course fictional, we capture narrative-based learning. That becomes an asset, a knowledge database for when uncertain things happen. Yeah, you learn far more in fictional environments than you do in factual environments. You learn more through failure and success. And you know this anyway. How many people have got children? Okay, do you tell them stories about how Janet and John stayed at home and did what Mummy and Daddy said, conformed with the family key performance indicators, obeyed the rules, as a result of which the world was a happy place? Anybody tell those as bedtime stories? Or do you do the Janet and John went into the woods against Mummy's and Daddy's advice and met fearsome wolves, dangerous witches, yeah? Safe consultants and other people, right? Sorry, I can't resist that one, right? Yeah. But of course, we save them at the end because we want them to sleep at night. We teach our children about failure, not about success. And the reason is avoidance of failure is a more successful learning strategy than imitation of success. And as uncertainty increases, the more knowledge you have of failure, the more resilient you are. The less knowledge you have of failure, the more problematic it is. And so this is basic 101 science in that sense. So over here, we're dealing with what's called abductive logic, which is one of the things I want to finish off on. Let's take the picture so you've got it. So, let's now look at complexity and then the CYNEFIN framework. It's a framework, not a model, by the way, and that's an important distinction. A model seeks to represent reality. A framework is a way of looking at reality. And you need to think about that one, but the difference is really important. So this is from Byron Arthur, who first introduced complexity thinking to economics. And the point he makes here, and it's the reason why actually a lot of people find complexity very difficult, is you're dealing with systems in which there is constant novelty. Yeah, the same thing never happens again the same way except by accident. There are so many things interacting with so many other things that you never get predictable patterns. Right? Now, there's lots of stuff available online on this. I've done a TEDx talk. There's a lot of stuff. I'm not going to go through the whole performance of the children's party story, yeah, because you can look that up and I've got limited time. But the essential thing to understand about complexity, it's a system where you can only know the present. Predictions about the future are very, very dangerous because it means you don't see things that you don't expect to see. In a complex system, novelty is constant. Therefore, that filtering, remember you don't see the gorilla, becomes problematic. So we have to develop new methods and techniques. But it doesn't mean we abandon the old. So, Let's draw CYNEFIN. How many people have seen CYNEFIN? Just checking, yeah. Started off as a strategic framework. Then I presented it at an XP conference in London. Anybody remember XP? Yeah, it's kind of, we all know about Agile? We all know about Scrum? Okay, one of the big bifurcation points is Agile coalesces around Scrum, not XP. Yeah, and that's actually quite interesting. I think it's one of the areas where it went wrong. Scrum is a very good structured technique. XP was unstructured. The reason it did that, by the way, as I keep explaining to the XP people, is they're so good programmers, they can't talk to ordinary humans. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why their methods didn't get picked up. But that goes back to that period. Either way, it then got adopted large-scale in IT. This domain here is called disorder. That's the state of not knowing what type of system you're in. And that's actually quite a dangerous place to be, because different types of systems have different relationships between cause and effect, and you'll do things differently. So we then get two types of system which are generally classed as ordered. That means there is a predictable relationship between cause and effect. Remember back on that earlier model, this is probable and to some extent possible. I've got symmetry past to present. So in one case, the decision can be obvious. So for example, in civilized countries, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. Sorry, I can't resist that one. Yeah. So if you arrive in the UK is one of the countries that you drive on the left. Yeah. So that's what you do. Yeah. If you land in Poland, it's one of the countries which drive on the right. So that's what you do. If you land in Italy, south of Naples, forget about laws. Yeah, it has actually been studied. The rule is fly to the center of the flock, match speed, avoid collision. Right? The Italian drivers drive like birds flock. And I can tell you that I drive the Sorrento coast now with serenity, because I don't bother about the traffic laws. I follow the next car, match speed, avoid collision. It kind of like all works. Right? So understanding where you are is important. So here, I sense, categorize, respond, I apply best practice. This is the only legitimate domain where you can get into these very rigid process-based control systems. If I over-apply the constraint, I get a catastrophic failure. It falls over the edge into chaos. One of the interesting things is I worked for IBM for 7 years, all right? I hasten to add I didn't volunteer, I was conscripted. But it was very valuable experience. IBM is so bureaucratic, it makes the US government feel like it's dynamic and customer-centric, right? And we were a small Anglo-Dutch company with about 3 levels of management, and they bought us to create the core for what became IBM Global Services. So it was a successful acquisition. But the first thing they did when they took us over was to charge us for coffee and ban alcohol. Now, we're a software development house, all right? The coffee-alcohol cycle is critical to good software development, right? Nobody should be expected to speak to users without alcohol first. You then need coffee to sober up. Then you need even more alcohol because users never want what you can prove they asked for. They want something different instead. Remember my unarticulated need point. So either way, we got around that. Then it got worse. They banned us for buying food for staff. No food may be bought for staff. Now, by now, we'd learned that you didn't argue with IBM bureaucrats on the basis of evidence-based policy, customer or employee need. That didn't work. The only technique which occasionally worked was the Socratic technique. And if you remember what Socrates did, is to ask people questions till they contradicted themselves. It's a lot of fun, but you have to remember the people of Athens got to the point where they condemned Socrates for corrupting children and made him commit suicide, all right? People don't like being forced to contradict themselves, but it is fun, yeah? So we went along. I'm sea level by now, all right? So I said, look, I was emergency call out the other night, 4 o'clock in the morning. You've probably all been here. Yeah, we got a VAX cluster which has crashed, carrying an emergency telephone system. And I don't say it's because you bastards wouldn't let the systems programmers go on a $200 training course because you said they could learn how to do an operating system upgrade from the manual. But there's no point in making that point because I'll save that for later, but it was very common. Yeah? Somebody else's budget. Yeah, big problem in not looking at things holistically. Either way, we got that problem. And I said, look, the only thing I can do is to keep people away from these guys, because the more they're asked what they're doing, the less they'll be able to do it. If you don't know the golden rule of good service management, if you have a client in a crisis, put somebody full-time on giving the client meaningless things to do. Every half hour, phone them up and give them something to do, right? Because then they feel you're engaged. This is actually a really good rule, by the way, all right? It's very effective, all right? And they'll stop bothering you all the time. Yeah? It's a very sensible technique. It's one of the ways you get salesmen to take responsibility for what they sold the client in the first place, is to put them into the front line here, right? So either way, coming back to this, right? So I said, the only thing I can do apart from that is to buy them pizza and Coke to keep them awake. And they looked really worried, so I realized they may have misinterpreted that. So I do mean Coca-Cola, and they sort of breathed a sigh of relief. And they said, okay, we understand this may be necessary. It's okay to buy food for staff if you get vice presidential approval 48 hours in advance. At this time, you stay very calm, right? You say, that's brilliant. We would never have thought of this, all right? This is one of the major advantages of joining IBM, that we get this sort of wisdom. And then you realize that irony and sarcasm are deadly weapons because they don't see them. Yeah? They said, what happens on the very rare occasion where we don't get 48 hours notice of a major service crisis? And they said, okay, well, you've got to be calm, all right? This is a Socratic technique, all right? You ask them a question. And they said, okay, we understand that may be necessary, very rarely. Country general manager approval after the event. Now, you know if you work for IBM, that means your expenses will disappear into the South Bank office. They'll never be signed. If you complain about it, your name will appear on the wrong sorts of lists. And you don't want to be on those lists at quarter end. So the practice emerged of over-tipping London taxi drivers. If you over-tip a London taxi driver, they give you a blank receipt. If you ask them how are they doing against Uber, they give you 3 blank receipts at the moment. They really hate Uber, right? And then what happened is the manager then filled out the blank receipt for the amount of money spent on pizza and Coke, claimed a taxi fare, and took the bus. Oh, and kept a parallel set of books signed off by the staff so they could prove what they'd done. Now, I gave that as an example at the Scrum Alliance conference in Berlin 2 years ago. This is 20 years later. 3 people from IBM ran up to me afterwards, showed me their wallets with blank receipts, and said, we're still doing that. Did you invent it? We've just completed a major project in the northeast of England where we've shown that the main cause of mental breakdown in police, ambulance services, and fire officers is not the job, it's the health and safety rules. Because people have been over-constrained based on an assumption of average behavior. In order to do the job which they love, they have to break the rules. And I will tell you now, you've got 10 to 15% of your service desk costs that you could take out because your staff are finding ways to work around the system because they care about your customers. Yeah? And the trouble is, you build up that sort of tension, sooner or later you get this sort of catastrophic failure. We then have the complicated domain. Here, it's not self-evident, maybe to experts, but not to everybody. It's not like driving on the left or driving on the right. So here, I sense, analyze, respond, and I apply good practice, not best practice. Now, that's an important distinction. In good practice, you don't put too many constraints in place. You allow people with enough experience some variation in practice. Now, that's actually really important. The danger is consultancy-led initiatives. Management consultants like forcing people into one way of doing things. Anybody with real experiences knows it's different. So that's a fairly important distinction. And then we move into the complex domain. And you should see now, if you remember that curve I drew earlier, this is ordered, this is complex. Yeah, I've now got so much variation, I can't see what's happening. All I can do here is probe, sense, respond, and I probe in parallel, not in sequence. One of the characteristics of a complex space, if you've got competing hypotheses about what we should do, and you can't resolve which is the right one within an acceptable time frame. So instead of trying to resolve it, you do a small experiment around any idea which is coherent over a short life cycle and see what happens. Yeah? You basically experiment in the present, not in the future. And the key thing that you discover here is that practice is called acceptive. Now, this is a new word for you, right? It's a neologism. It comes from evolutionary biology. So you all know about adaptation. So all dinosaurs had feathers. Your children may not know that because the children's books aren't up to date, so you can get high street cred, right? All dinosaurs had feathers. Yeah, and they evolved for warmth or sexual display. But then there was a group of dinosaurs who lived at the top of trees, and if you live at the top of trees, it's cold, so you get more feathers, but you also start to fall off the trees, and if you've got lots of feathers, you glide. And that's how we got flight. It wasn't an adaptation, it was an acceptation. Under conditions of stress, something which evolved for one purpose gets reused for something else. Yeah? The cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved in the higher apes to do fine-grained manipulation of muscles in fingers. It exacts in humans to do fine-grained control of grammar in human language. The sophistication of human grammar is too much. It couldn't happen in a linear way. It required a non-linear repurposing, and that's called acceptation. 1940s, a Raytheon engineer maintaining the magneto of a radar machine notices a chocolate bar melts in their pocket. They realize the significance. We get microwave ovens. The whole of the drug industry is dependent on people noticing side effects. Remember where I went back to IBM and Microsoft? Rapidly repurposing an existing capability for a novel purpose is what we're good at as a species, or at least we used to before we stopped trying to treat people like robots. So in here, you want that ability to repurpose, and there's all sorts of implications for this on the way by database management, how you store lessons learned. The work we've been doing with the US Army in Afghanistan is storing data in unstructured, not structured ways, so you get chance or accidental recall. Yeah, we're now designing systems for serendipitous discovery, not structured discovery. Yeah, and actually there's a whole body of work on this on how to design for accidents, not for anything else. So that's basically what CYNEFIN is about. Yeah? There's more material on that, but I want to finish off by looking at a very specific application of this and look at this in terms of the context of cultural mapping. Now, this here is from work we've done with one of the big American companies where we've got engineers to continuous fragmented observations of day-to-day occurrences. And critically, the engineer has self-interpreted those into an abstract framework. I haven't got time to go into that, I've written on it. And here we capture voice and pictures as well as text because it's easier for people to tell things. The work we're doing with nurses, a nurse can take a picture of the patient, write things down and record the patient. That's called a sense-making item. A combination of media rather than one, because the critical thing is the person who contributes the material then interprets it into a quantitative framework. Yeah, so that's the whole process. We do this on cultural mapping as well. Now what we got here is a probability distribution based on thousands of incidents. This one here is civilian manufacture. This is military. This dimension here is rule compliance. This dimension here is job completion. Now you can immediately see the problem in civilian. There are two mutually incompatible states. You either get the job done or you follow the rules. All of the surveys, all of the interviews, all of the focus groups say they're doing both because people know that's what the right answer is. The day-to-day observations in ungameable self-signification means we see this pattern. Nobody on the board challenged this when I showed them. They knew this was happening. We now had the evidence. If you look at this one, this looks like it's really good, doesn't it? People are following the rules and getting the job done, so maybe we should go and copy them. But then you look at the underlying data, you discover it's all from nuclear weapons testing. Well, that creates an existential quality to job completion and rule compliance you don't get in other contexts, right? The dominant one is ignore the rules, or we've given up. We're seeing this pattern with nurses in hospitals across Europe. In a crisis, they're brilliant. On a day-to-day basis, they break the rules to provide care for patients, but increasingly they're just doing what they have to do to survive. And I've seen the same in service desk management. This is a very common pattern. Yeah? Now, the solution here is not to create a grandiose program up here, which says, if we all want to be up here, that's the classic approach. The real approach is you find this, which is called an adjacent possible in complexity. It's a cluster of behavior which is going in the right direction. And then literally we click on that, look at the underlying material, and say, what can we do tomorrow to create more like these, fewer like those? That's what we do with cultural mapping. People tell the story they would tell their best friend if their best friend was offered a job in the organization. No assumptions made in that. They interpret it in ways that they don't know what the interpretation means, and we draw these maps. And then literally as a manager, you say, what can we do tomorrow to create more stories like this, fewer stories like that, rather than how do we create an XYZ culture? It's a different theory of change. And of course, if I've got that at a board level, then actually each department has their own picture. And the point about this is in complexity, everything is context specific. In order, everything is context free. So each department will have a different pattern against the whole. So we start to manage in the tails of distributions rather than the center of distributions, and that gives us competitive advantage. And a sort of final picture to illustrate this point, this is from work we're doing on peace and reconciliation, but we're also now doing in companies. So on cybersecurity, we're measuring attitudes, not compliance. If you're looking at cybersecurity, compliance is a lag indicator, attitudes is a lead indicator. Yeah? If you actually have compliance measures, people are scared about the consequences, so you can't trust what they say. So what we do is we present an infographic about a major security breach in another industry, never in their own industry. We get them to interpret it onto a series of triangles. We develop that because triangles are ambiguous. You don't know where the right answer is. And then they also say why it can't happen here and what would happen if it did. And from that, we draw these sort of maps. And it shows how different groups of people see the same situation. Yeah, and that can literally be done as a pulse survey every 3 or 4 days across a sample of the staff. So you as a manager now know what attitudes are, and you can intervene if things are starting to go in the wrong direction. Everything in complexity is about managing the dispositional state of the system. It means it's more important to describe the present than define a future state. You actually want to define a journey. You want a pathway to the future. But if you start journeys, you can discover novelty on the pathway. If you have rigid goals, you won't see the novelty because you're focused on that. And this is the same technique we use for unarticulated needs. Clusters of people's day-to-day frustrations with systems. Once we get a significant cluster, we put a pair programming team onto the cluster to develop a prototype and see if that's what people want. You break away from nonlinear processes. So what I've tried to do is to give you a wider picture. Just as systems thinking came in the 80s, complexity thinking is coming in now. And it was 3 to 4 years from systems thinking being obscure academic to dominance. That's where we are at the moment. The future of management is in understanding our system as an ecosystem, not as an engine or an engineering drawing. Thank you very much for your time.